Hi everyone, this is our opening keynote for the 50 plus Shades of Gothic conference series, and I'm very happy and thankful to have with us Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock for it. And I think that when it comes to the American Gothic and popular culture, he doesn't really need much of an introduction. So I will try to be brief and just let him speak. Jeffrey is professor of English at Central Michigan University, where he has been teaching a variety of courses on American literature and popular culture since 2001. He's a scholar of the Gothic with a vast academic production, in particular on supernatural fiction, film, and television. His research interests span topics related to, among many, monsters, ghosts, vampires, and the female Gothic. He is also an associate editor for the Journal of the Fantastic in the Arts. And besides a long list of published essays, he edited 3 collections of tales by H.P. Lovecraft and has published over 20 books, among which Spectral America, Phantoms and the National Imagination in 2004, the vampire film Undead Cinema in 2012, and the Monster Theory Reader in 2020. And he was as well the editor of the Cambridge Companion to the American Gothic in 2018. So Jeffrey, your work evidently spans across different disciplines and subjects, and yet most of it, to some extent, revolves around the Gothic and the ways Gothic texts tackle old and new anxieties. But how was your interest in the Gothic born, and how has it developed? And why do you think it is worth exploring the Gothic from an academic standpoint?
Okay, let me start by thanking you and the organizers of the event for inviting me. I'm honored to be here. And it's also wonderful to see some familiar names in the list of participants. So sending a hello to Anya and to Michael and to Kevin, who I have communicated with but never actually met in person. So thank you for inviting me. As far as my developing interest in the Gothic, it was an early predilection for ghost stories that I increasingly channeled into an academic pursuit. I place a lot of the blame on the doorstep of Disney, I think. I was obsessed with the Disney's Haunted Mansion at Disney World, which I went to sometime when I was around 8 or 9 years old. It was the ride I kept wanting to go back on. And at about the same time, there was a Sunday night weekly program called The Wonderful World of Disney. And I remember vividly a story about the ghost of a little Creole girl. It was called Child of Glass. I remember to this day being kind of mesmerized by this story about this ghostly little girl who needed the help of a living boy to recover this lost sachet of diamonds, I think it was, or else she would be eternally doomed or something like that. About the same, must have been a conversion of events, because about the same time I found, this was primary school, in the library, a collection of stories. It was called Alfred Hitchcock's Haunted Houseful. It was a collection of ghost stories. And that was something that I checked out multiple times until I almost had memorized those stories. I think probably Toby Hooper's Poltergeist in 1983 kind of sealed the deal for me, because it was one of the first horror movies that I saw in the theater. And I remember sort of being on the edge of my seat for that. And then it was a sort of a gradual process of exploring the Gothic and horror stories. I remember the lurid covers that were done by an artist named Michael Whalen for the H.P. Lovecraft Del Rey editions that you could see when they used to have bookstores in malls. Um, I would sort of stare at the covers to the Lovecraft collections until I started to read H.P. Lovecraft. And then from there, sort of a gradual process of development. I got interested in the literary ghost story. So Edgar Allan Poe was something that I fell into from there. Stephen King, at some point, The Haunting of Hill House from Shirley Jackson. So it was kind of a natural fit then in graduate school that the focus of my doctoral dissertation became on ghost stories and the hauntedness or the ghostly qualities of language. And the linchpin that I used was the idea of the dead letter, the letter from the living that goes astray, but also the letter from the dead that reaches its destination. So for that, I was looking at um, Edgar Allan Poe and Henry James, and it went all the way up to Toni Morrison and Beloved. And then out of the dissertation came my first monograph, which is a book called Scare Tactics, Supernatural Fiction by American Women. Because in the process of researching for the doctoral dissertation, I discovered that there were hundreds of ghost stories that were published by women in the 19th century in the American periodical press that very little notice had been taken of them. And in reading them, it became clear to me that in many cases they were using strategically as a kind of metaphor for the displaced or disempowered situation of women in 19th century America, who were essentially the ghosts in the room, who weren't seen, recognized, appreciated fully. So the case that I make in that first book is there is this, or had been this unacknowledged feminist tradition of supernatural writing in American fiction. And then I was also working at that point on the Spectral America collection, which was an edited collection of essays. And I've sort of graduated outwards from ghost stories, as you mentioned, to focusing on vampires and then monsters in general. But um, I do think my first love remains the ghost story. I keep coming back to ghosts and ghost stories. As for why I think the Gothic is worth exploring, it is to me this dense site of the cultural imaginary where very culturally specific anxieties and desires come together. You know, what we fear, what we hope for. Sometimes it wears its politics on its sleeve. Other times you have to dig more deeply to kind of excavate what's underlying there. But Gothic tales, I would argue, always tell us a lot about ourselves, which is worth attending to. And for our moment right now, the proliferation of the Gothic and its ubiquity in various mainstream formats, it kind of insists that we take notice of it. Um, there's definitely been a mainstreaming of speculative fiction in general and the Gothic in particular. And it's interesting to consider what kinds of cultural forces might be propelling it center stage.
Yeah, so as you say, that is culturally charged. You have worked mostly on the American Gothic. And so what do you think characterizes it? What are its peculiarities that you find strictly related to the American context?
Um, I would start by answering the question. I'm a little wary of speaking in generalities about the American Gothic because I think it's sometimes more productive to think in terms of regional character, and also bearing in mind sort of different temporal moments. That said, in the introduction to the Cambridge Companion to the American Gothic, I'm going to share my screen for just 1 second, if that's okay.
Sure.
Um, I included this fairly rudimentary Venn diagram. Are you seeing it? Where there are kind of four,
Yep.
showing, yeah, kind of four locations or emphases of this was for the American Gothic. So religion, geography, otherness, and rationality. Um, for religion, I was making the case it's hard to think about the American Gothic without going back to the Puritan roots of the American experience. And there is an intensely Gothic quality to Puritan writings of the 16th, the 17th, and the 18th centuries, in which you have this stern and angry God who causes things to happen in the world for inscrutable reasons. Um, and there's all the fire and brimstone language. So I argue there that they're sort of the roots of the American Gothic can be traced back to this Puritan religious imaginary, which dovetails quite closely then with the role of the frontier in developing the American Gothic in particular. And you see that in Puritan writings and into the 19th century, that the wilderness is the place where one leaves behind civilization and encounters danger. Um, so in something like Charles Brockden Brown's work, who is an American Gothic author who wrote at the very end of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century, it's about going off into the forest. Or James Fenimore Cooper, it's about going off into the forest. Or Herman Melville, it's about going out onto the ocean. It's always about leaving behind the domestic circle and going off on these adventures into some kind of uncharted territory. Edgar Allan Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym falls into that category as well. You sort of leave behind all the trappings of civilization and confront that dark side, the dangerous side of existence. Um, that then segues quickly into the idea of the American Gothic as being preoccupied with the encounter with the other, whether it's a Native American presence that resides within the wilderness, or I think more insistently and to this day, the legacy of slavery and the necessity of having to accommodate the fact of the slave trade of American slavery. And so there is that dark side to the American literary experience and the sort of American imagination that has to do with the encounter with otherness. And then the fourth part of that Venn diagram that I put up has to do with rationality, that the concern that the Enlightenment principles upon which the United States of America was founded do not, in fact, hold true or consistently, that, in fact, human beings are not fundamentally rational or able to govern themselves, but instead are compelled or motivated by other forces, sometimes forces of which the individual is not even aware. And you see a lot of that in the movement from the 18th century to the 19th century, from the 18th century Gothic to Gothic authors like Poe or Charles Brockden Brown, that give us characters who are compelled by unconscious forces, madness, that results in atrocious acts or them acting in ways that which they're not consciously aware. So those are sort of the four poles of the American, like if we can talk in broad strokes, those are the four categories that I have focused on. I might add now to that category of rationality, which I didn't do in the Cambridge Companion to the American Gothic, but something about the rapaciousness of capitalist exploitation would need to be there and as well.
Yeah, and as you were saying already at the beginning, Gothic modes have been used in cross-genre popular culture products. It's become ubiquitous, and there are just sometimes little hints, but they are there. So thinking of the production of pop culture in recent years, let's say from the turn of the century up to the present, what do you think has been the relationship between the Gothic and popular culture? And these elements that you were just describing now, do you think they're still there? Can you trace them in these popular culture products?
I would say that, you know, from the late 18th, early 19th century up through the present, the Gothic has always been very firmly entrenched within the sphere of the popular. From penny dreadfuls and shilling shockers to the horror pulp magazines of the 1930s and the 1940s, up to the present with horror games and horror podcasts and novels and films and fan fiction and creepypasta and all the rest. The Gothic has been aligned more fully with popular culture than, you know, elite or high culture. I think there are a number of reasons for that. Some of it has to do with the sensationalistic aspect of the Gothic. It's transgressions of decorum. It's eliciting of a bodily response. All of this is antithetical to conventional notions of good taste and elite culture. I think the bodily nature of the Gothic here is important. Linda Williams has written that there are these three categories of literature or of media that fall into the category of body genre: horror, melodrama, and pornography. And not, not coincidentally, all three of those are ones that traditional academic appraisal has kind of kept at arm's length. Um, Anything that targets the body has been seen as less worthy of analysis than those that seem to be more intensely cerebral. I would also add, I think there's a populist orientation to the Gothic from its beginnings, which disdains a corrupt aristocracy, a debased clergy, self-serving mechanisms of social control, police forces, psychology, and so on. So you see it all the way at its beginnings with something like Matthew Lewis's The Monk and Anne Radcliffe's predatory aristocrats, moving forward, the kind of radical uncertainty that young Goodman Brown discovers when he goes wandering in the woods in Hawthorne's story. And it calls into question all his faith in the goodness of the people of his town. You see it really firmly in something like Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, in which a woman is being controlled by her husband, who is simultaneously her doctor. She's sort of doubly disempowered. And the Gothic mode is there used as a way to express the fact that no one is listening to her, no one is hearing her, what she voices. All the way up to something like the film Get Out, which similarly is functioning as a kind of social critique, the suggestion, calling into question the idea that the United States is some kind of post-racial society by making clear that it is anything but. So I would respond to the question by just suggesting that the Gothic has always been closely aligned with popular culture because of all of its emphases are antithetical to conventional notions of good taste and decorum and elite culture and so on.
Yeah, and I guess also, yes, the body, and I guess the topic of madness and in general, some psychological unwellness is a topic that it's not quite elitist. It's not quite, when you question that kind of stuff, it goes out of the elitist sphere, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's Fred Botting who refers to the Gothic as being the literature of transgression. So there's always a transgressive quality to the Gothic. There's an interesting question to my mind whether most Gothic narratives end up as being conservative retrenchments of the status quo, or whether there's something actually radical about them. Because what happens in most Gothic narratives is that you have the messy middle part in which things get thrown into disarray, but in most cases, everything is conveniently put back in place at the end. So often I think of the ending sometimes as being a kind of alibi that allows us to enjoy the messy middle part. But sometimes the politics of the Gothic can be a little dicey.
Getting back on the tracks, and yeah, there was some mess there, but it's fixed.
Right.
So talking about popular culture, you worked on a book that is coming out, I think, very soon, Pop Culture for Beginners. And it's going to be, and I quote, an introductory textbook for undergraduate course adoption, introducing students to the history of the study of popular culture, outlining various theoretical approaches. So besides writing about it, you have been teaching courses on both the Gothic and popular culture. What are, you think, the challenges and benefits of teaching and learning about these topics?
Thank you for mentioning the book, which will be coming out from Broadview this fall, and it's my second foray into doing a textbook.
Which is quite different from doing a monograph.
Right.
Completely different.
Writing for a different audience. And the reason I ended up doing that one is because I periodically teach an introduction to popular culture course, and I couldn't find the textbook that I really wanted, so I decided I would go ahead and do it myself. Where I start with the book is what I call the pop culture paradox. The idea that our popular culture pursuits are at the same time incredibly important to us, but at the same time totally meaningless. I love the show, but it's just the show. I love this game, but it's only a game. So I'm fascinated with this tendency to disavow the importance or the complexity or the meaningfulness of things that we actually love, which I is the kind of resistance that I typically see when I start to teach a popular culture course. Uh, I think there are a lot of reasons for this kind of knee-jerk dismissal of the value and the complexity of the things that we do for enjoyment. Um, Part of it clusters around uh, the ideas of labor and utility. We tend to associate value with things that are difficult. The harder something is to master, the more its mastery seems to matter. So you can think sort of like James Joyce versus Harry Potter, or Joyce versus Stephen King, right? Um, we tend to dismiss the thing as less meaningful or important that lots of people can access and enjoy. But you could reasonably turn that on its head. You know, which one matters most? The book that's been read by millions, or the book that you need a college class spending a semester on to learn how to appreciate? So I also think there's a tendency to mistake the familiar for the simple. Because something is familiar to us, we have frameworks, like well-established frameworks to make sense of it. We don't even realize we're engaged in a process of interpretation when the process is familiar to us. So we think that there isn't much there to interpret. Um, so it's sort of fascinating to me that our activities that are outside of work, um, on the one hand, they're the rewards for our job well done. Um, but on the other hand, they're things that we dismiss as not being particularly important or serious. So the the irony that is at the core of the book at the start is that there seems to be this inverse correlation between enjoyment and perception of value. The more we enjoy it, the less it seems like work, the less important or meaningful we perceive it as being. So what I do with the textbook then is I ask students to bracket off those value judgments, to consider how meaning is created and conveyed in different media. So the framework that I privilege for the book is a semiotic approach to popular culture. We look at different forms of popular culture as rule-governed systems of communication. We start by looking at, okay, so what is this thing? How is it constructed? What kinds of associations attach itself to it? And where we end up is always with the question of ideology. How does this object or practice affirm or challenge particular understandings of the world? And I think the classroom itself is a great space, literally, to explore those issues, because I start by asking them. This was when we were doing face-to-face, so obviously this applies a little less right now via Zoom. But take a look at the way that your classroom is oriented. You have these little desks where students have to sit. Your instructor has the privilege of moving about and standing up. It's usually a kind of sterile space without much decoration to it, all of which is intended to convey certain understandings about what education is and how it takes place. And the traditional model is that students sit passively and the instructor kind of unscrews their head and pours in knowledge and shakes them up and asks them to regurgitate it. So there's a whole worldview that we can extrapolate from just the classroom space itself. So I asked them to think about what are other ways that a classroom could be constructed where you wouldn't have that division between the professor and the divide between the classroom, where you're not ensconced in this tiny little desk that won't keep anything on it because it keeps rolling off onto the floor and so on. So back to the Gothic, like in as much as I consider the Gothic to fall under the umbrella of popular culture, we can employ the same approach, I would say. We can start by saying, okay, so what is this thing? How does it say it? What cultural work does it do in terms of reinforcing or undermining established understandings of the world? And ultimately, we look at, is this a progressive challenge to conventional wisdom? Is it a conservative reaffirmation of existing power structures? Goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago. Usually the status quo ante is restored at the end of a Gothic work. This is particularly in monster movies, right? The monster is this eruption of chaos that needs to be dealt with. And then we watch as the protagonist try to figure out, okay, what is this thing? How do we address it? And typically at the end, the threat is resolved and things more or less go back to normal. Of course, we know now in the era of the franchise that the monster is never totally gone. It will always be back in the sequel, but for a moment, things have returned to the way that they were, which may well be the, as I call it, the alibi that lets us kind of enjoy the mayhem of the middle.
That the monster is going to be tamed at the end somehow. Right. But do you think that this approach that students have towards popular culture, so that they think it's just something, yes, I watched it, but it's just a series, but it's just a movie. Do you think it has something to do with how academia maybe is? The approach, the academic status quo, or the academic notion that the epistemic authority needs to focus on serious stuff, like topics that are respectable and they're somehow worthy of research.
The range of responses is really interesting. I do think there's a tendency to make a division between things that are fun and things that matter, things that are important. And the popular culture activities that they pursue tend to fall on the side of fun. So they dismiss them as not being as meaningful as the things that they have to work hard in order to master or to achieve. And I try to point out that some of the reasons that the pop culture pursuits seem simple is just because they're so well versed in it and understand how it functions that they don't consider themselves as engaged in a process of interpretation. Yeah. There's also the strange sense that to interpret something is to dispel its magic, that if we look at it too carefully and consider how it works, it won't function in the same way for them as an escape or a form of enjoyment. Now, in some cases, when you start to look at the politics of the thing, that may well be the case, right? You look at the gender politics of a particular horror film in the way that sex equals death in the slasher films of the 1980s. And they start to see that there are these messages there. And so maybe there is a kind of concern that if I look at it too carefully, I'll see something that I don't really want to see.
Yeah, it's not fun anymore.
Because I won't be able to enjoy it in the same
spoil it.
So there's this concern that you're going to spoil it by looking too closely. And I try to point out to them, or at least I don't know how successful I am, but I make the argument that if you esteem this thing, like if you really enjoy it, then scrutinizing it carefully is an act of homage. Like you're actually, if you value the thing enough to consider how it works, you're demonstrating that you really do have affection for this thing. Which is often the way I think we as academics tend to function, right? Is that we focus our scholarship often on things that we enjoy. At least maybe that's increasingly the case. The idea of the Henry Jenkins ACA academic or ACA fan, who takes as the focus of their research things that they enjoy in general.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, the fact that I do a critical analysis of it doesn't mean I'm going to hate it or that I don't like it anymore. I think it's good because you're analyzing and working hard on something you enjoy, at least. That's not always the case. So I think it's very good to enjoy that.
They do resist what they presume to be overreading or overinterpretation of something. There's the comic or the meme that circulates where someone is interpreting the color of the drapes or the curtains in the room as being blue, as being reflective of the melancholy of the protagonist, and the author says, no, they're just blue curtains. Nevertheless,
nevertheless, maybe unconsciously you pick that color. I mean,
Well, I think there's something to that. Like, first of all, artists and authors are not entirely in control of the workings of their
Mhm.
productions. You can have unconscious elements that find their way in. Second, there's the inherent ambiguity of language itself, which is always subject to multiple and sometimes competing interpretations. So authorial intent does not necessarily control the interpretation that a reader arrives at. And I tell them, if you can support the interpretation that you're making by showing moments in the text, there's nothing to say it's wrong, even if the author should say, no, I just meant the drapes to be blue.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I had authors reading my analysis and telling me that they realized the things about their own work that they didn't mean to put in it, or they didn't realize that they were conveying stuff in a certain way. And other authors saying that, well, no, you trashed my my work, and I'm unhappy and angry about it. But I think it's just part of the job. I mean, and really,
Well, as we were saying before things started recording, that's why
yeah,
it's always safer to deal with the works of somebody who's dead. They're less
yeah.
likely to come back and correct you.
Yeah, they cannot get angry at you and block you on Facebook or something.
Well, they can begin to haunt you, but it
Yeah.
happens less frequently.
Yeah. Well, and now as a conclusion before the Q&A session, I know that in 2016 you published a book, Goth Music from Sound to Subculture, co-authored with musicologist Isabella Van Elfer. Goth music and its scene have been a long-lasting part of your life, and you've been DJing goth music for 20 years. So can you tell us something about the goth subculture itself and your own experience with it? And also, I enjoy this kind of music, but how would you describe it for the public who might not be familiar with it?
Um, okay, so I have had a long affiliation with goth music and alternative music in general, which goes back to kind of new wave music of the 1980s, which is really what I grew up with. Like, that was my moment. So it was a kind of slippery slope for me from bands like Depeche Mode and Gary Newman and New Order to bands like the Mission UK and Susie and the Banshees and Bauhaus on the one hand, and the bands like Ministry and Skinny Puppy and Front 242 on the other. So I kind of grew up with that in my teenage years. Um, I had the distinction in college of working in the first music store in Philadelphia that was dedicated to compact discs, because that was new. And it was all CD, and it was on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania. So it was it was definitely a great place to work, very relaxed. But we would play whatever we wanted when we were working in the store, so we had the opportunity to explore various different bands or styles that would weren't necessarily getting play on the air, like on the radio. Um, I made the jump to actually DJing in graduate school in Washington, D.C., and I've held a number of club residencies as a DJ. There was a goth industrial fetish event in DC called Bound, and I became a resident DJ for that. When I moved to Hartford, actually met my wife that way, by the way. She was running an event in Hartford, and I went up for a guest spot, and that's how we met. Like, she was running the event, I was there to DJ the event. But then I had a residency for an event in New York City called Contempt for several years, which took place in the most kind of Gothic industrial space that you could possibly imagine, because it was this permanently moored rusting hulk of a boat in the Chelsea Piers area of New York that had been converted into a club space, and you were kind of in the bowels of this rusting boat. It was crazy. Uh, um, from there, it was about the same time um, I was teaching as a visiting assistant professor at the University of Connecticut, which has its own community radio station associated with it. And I began to do a radio show called Dark Nation Radio because I was looking for an opportunity to play tracks beyond what would be acceptable for dance floor play. And there's lots of material that's not suitable for the dance floor. So I started the radio show. This was 1999. When we relocated to Michigan, which is where I am now, I continued the radio show for a number of years on the Central Michigan University student station. Then the station underwent a transition into something else. So it went online to a site called live365.com, and then it's bounced around a few places. Currently, I do the show, which is called Dark Nation Radio. It's a live broadcast once a week. And then I have a Mixcloud page, which is mixcloud.com/one word cypheractive, CY.
And we're going to put it in the description below.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So the recorded broadcasts are all available there. And I still, at least pre-COVID, was doing occasional guest spots here and there, but it involves a lot more traveling at this point, which is harder to negotiate when you have a family than when you're single. But so anyway, I've had this long association with goth and industrial music. What has been fascinating for me about goth music, and this is where Isabella Van Elfren and I came together for the book. I met Isabella. We used to attend the same conference annually, the International Conference for the Fantastic in the Arts in Florida. And so we met there and we began talking about our shared affection for goth music. And one of the interesting things that we focused on was how goth serves as, it has a very distinct aesthetic that's associated with it. But in terms of the music, it's a very broad umbrella that accommodates a range of different musical styles, from down tempo kind of mopey music to much more kind of harsher electronic material. So if you attend sort of practically a goth event, you're likely to hear everything from a band like Bauhaus or the Sisters of Mercy or Christian Death to something like the electronic music that's associated with Front 242, or even something that's much more abrasive. There are bands like, I don't know how much of this will resonate with listeners, but bands like Combi Christ, for example, who have distorted vocals, and just a very kind of harsh sound. So what we were trying to investigate with the book was, how is it that goth functions as this umbrella category, bringing together these different subgenres, which are really quite distinct? How can one event accommodate all of these different styles? We wanted to go beyond thinking about goth as merely an aesthetic, and or where music is concerned, just focusing or privileging on lyrics, and to focus instead on the qualities of the music itself, which is where it was really helpful to be working with a musicologist. Because one of the things that I quickly discovered starting to think about music is there's a very specialized vocabulary for the conversation about music, which at that point I lacked. So I had to educate myself about how you actually talk about the distinctive qualities of timbre, for example, and duration, and things like that. Our approach in the book was to bring in the work of Mikhail Bakhtin and his notion of the chronotope, these kind of time spaces that literature constructs that give the characteristic flavor to different types of novels. And we were trying to use that as a way to think about different time spaces, if you will, for the types of music that get played at goth clubs, the kinds of narratives of the heroic past or the future that are developed through a combination of the qualities of the sound and through lyrical content. It was a departure for me in terms of the research I had done before, but it remained close to my heart because this was music I was so familiar with, and it was quite enjoyable, I think, to go in that direction.
Yeah, and talking about what we were just saying, when you get to analyze in detail examine something that you really love or something that you really enjoy. I mean, it should be an enjoyable process. It shouldn't be something that you see as it's going to spoil it for me. So I'm sure you got to know the music you love even better, and the culture that it's related to it even better. So I'm sure it was a great experience to write this book.
I mean, it was a very, I've done a number of collaborations, like collaborative book projects, which I have just universally enjoyed. And it was wonderful to work with Isabella on the book. And it was kind of exhilarating, I think, to pursue the research in a direction I hadn't gone before.
Mm.
So I appreciated the opportunity for that.
And it's always, anyway, I think enriching to work with theory, that to apply theory that you know, but you apply it to something else, and you're working with someone that works on stuff, and you know, like the terminology you didn't know. It's a new world you can just crack open and enjoy, and surely you're going to use it again. That knowledge is not wasted. As sometimes students have that notion that if you learn something that you're just going to use for this one essay, it's going to be useless and it's too much work and it's not going to come back anymore in your life. But I think sadly it's the opposite. It's really
sometimes it's less this specific facts or pieces of information that you acquire along the way, and more a way of approaching things or thinking about problems, or a general orientation for thinking about culture. I mean, it's training yourself to be a critical thinker and to look at things with a close eye. That to me is what we should be training our students to do, is to think critically, to have a kind of critical literacy that allows them to evaluate an argument, how persuasive something is, the forms of rhetoric that are being utilized. What are the forms of manipulation that are being utilized here? I think it's more vital than ever that we equip young people with the ability to distinguish between fact and fake news, real news, fake news, to be aware of their own kind of inherent biases when it comes to that. So, yeah.
Yeah, so before I get started on fake news, that's one of my strong topics. We can just, I think, move on to the Q&A session. So if the public has questions, you can raise your hand now, and we can just organize a little bit the Q&A session. And of course, I thank you for the part of the interview that was very interesting. And if we went a little bit astray with the questions that we had. So we have Laura.
Well, hello. Thank you so much for being here with us today, because it's been really interesting. My question traces back to your very first answer to Anna's questions, when you mentioned that your interest in the Gothic began with watching Disney movies, and I'm guessing also cartoons. So my question was about, how do you think the way the Gothic is present in children's fiction, and I'm thinking specifically about cartoons and television shows, how is it, if it is different from the way the Gothic manifests in fiction that's more directed to adults, and whether you think there's been an evolution in the way that Gothic is present in children's products from, I guess, from several decades ago to how it is now in mainstream cartoons, such as, and I was thinking specifically about shows such as Gravity Falls and Over the Garden Wall, which are two shows that I really like.
And both of them are wonderful. Actually, my first thought while you were asking the question, though, had to do with fairy tales. And the fact that if you were to read Grimm's fairy tales or fairy tales from the 18th and the 19th century, they're far more violent and much darker than the more sanitized version of fairy tales that children receive today, which seems to me to suggest a significant change in the way that we think about childhood and the necessity of protecting children from darker messages or imagery. So on the one hand, I think it's interesting to consider sort of those shifts in forms of representation from the 19th century to the 21st in the way that fairy tales have been altered so that they're far less disturbing than something like Struwelpeter, you know, something like that. Particularly with your reference points with Gravity Falls and Over the Garden Wall. Here, I think we need to think carefully about audience, because one of the evolutions in the production of animation in cartoons is the attempt to broaden the audience to include both adults and children. So I think both of them, and particularly Over the Garden Wall, are attempting to walk a kind of line where the story is not too scary for children, but at the same time is appealing for adults. I think the films of Pixar are even a better example of that, where you can have kind of nods and winks towards the adults who are viewing at the same time that the narrative can be consumed by children who don't get the allusions or the reference points. Beyond that, I'm sort of trying to think what I find. Well, what I would say is the big shift that I see in cartoons that I have two boys who are ages 6 and 10. So we do a lot of cartoon watching. And what has been so amazing to me is the emphasis on diversity and inclusion in children's media that, from my perspective, seems kind of astounding and wonderful, and from my kids' perspective is just normal. But it's part of a kind of general inversion of Gothic narratives where the monster isn't the monster. Those who pursue the monster are the monster. That is, it's a culture. Those who demonize difference are the true monsters. So I would say that there's an inversion of conventional ideas of monstrosity, where looking different or being different is not a marker of monstrosity. It's those who insult or demean those who look or act differently. Do you know Kipo in the Age of the Wonder Beasts? I'm thinking Kipo in particular there, where it's about, you know, getting rid of all the mutants so that everything was back the way that it was. So I would say that in terms of the Gothic, the storyline has been turned on its head, where it's no longer about this eruption of strangeness or monstrosity that needs to be tamped down. It's about appreciating difference, and those who attempt to constrain people to specific courses are in fact the true monsters of children's narrative. What do you think?
No, that's very interesting, and I think that's very nice, and yeah, thank you.
We have Sophia has a question.
Hi.
Hi.
So first of all, thank you, Jeffrey, for a fascinating chat. It really means a lot to us to have you, so thanks. So you have written about like a million things and a million different cultural products. So I'm gonna focus on one of them, if that's okay. In 2016, you co-edited a volume, Return to Twin Peaks, where you sort of assessed Twin Peaks as Gothic due to its weird uncanny, defamiliarized presentation of matter and of objects. So I was wondering actually about the movie Fire Walk with Me, and my question is if you think that the movie sort of intensifies this Gothicism that we find in the TV show, or if it, on the contrary, veers toward other genres like slasher or thriller, or, well, yeah, that's what I was wondering about. Thanks.
Okay, Twin Peaks is something that's near and dear to my heart, so I appreciate the question very much. That said, I'm trying to remember the specific details of the film, which I haven't seen in a long time. I know what I mainly have is in my brain, and I think this is from the film, is just the incredibly horrific vision in the train car, right? And with Bob, and my tendency to think about the film is as, I think, the way that you put it, a kind of intensification of the series. I don't see it veering into the slasher category particularly. In keeping with David Lynch's work in general, there's that kind of absurdist element that he interweaves throughout, that sometimes is there to evoke humor, but often is just to raise questions, I think, or to ask us to think more deeply. My answer would be that I see it as just being Twin Peaks, but more so. Of course, did you see The Return?
Yeah, I did. I saw it like when it came out, so it was kind of like back in the old day, one chapter at a week thing, and I haven't rewatched it like the whole thing at a time yet. But yeah, I'm still thinking about what everything means, that third chapter.
I think it's the most David Lynch thing that David Lynch has ever done.
I agree.
It's kind of an 18-hour movie experience of Twin Peaks in which he really refuses to gratify the viewer who is the fan of Twin Peaks for almost the entire thing. All of us are waiting for Kyle MacLachlan's Cooper to return in The Return. We don't get that until near the very end, and then everything is called into question. He pulls the rug out from beneath your feet when he said, "What year is this?" And then we get the scream again. That was Cheryl Lee's scream from the original Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
And then it ends. He's definitely not there. I think it's to make it easy for us.
It's definitely frustrating, a frustrating experience. Yeah, I was just wondering if it was that sort of intensification, because it seems like the movie feels more bleak, more violent, more horrible in every possible way. And you know, many people rejected it when it came out. I think it was even booed at Cannes. And so yeah, to me it feels like, you say, more of Twin Peaks, like an intensification of Twin Peaks. So it's weird to me that it wasn't like appreciated at its time, when it's actually like, yeah, like more of what we were watching before. And also it's kind of Gothic in the way that it's like the past of Twin Peaks that's haunting Twin Peaks, you know, revealed and exposed.
And it works very well, Twin Peaks in general, I think, for the case that I was making about the role of the frontier in the American Gothic, the woods that are haunted, that surrounds. And in a similar kind of way, I was also arguing for the kind of Puritan religious roots of the American Gothic. And what you get in Twin Peaks is a kind of displaced religiosity, I guess you could call it, with the White Lodge and the Black Lodge and the spirit world that seems to coexist with the material world and occasionally interact with it in various ways, which to me is a hallmark of the Gothic. That what the Gothic insists is that the world that of our senses that we can see, feel, and touch is only a small part of some larger experience of reality that includes these other kinds of powers and forces in the universe.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and everything is in Twin Peaks, right? Like...
Absolutely.
And we have another question. Trang.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for your insight to the Gothic, and I really enjoyed the talk. So I think my question kind of touched on your mention of how kind of the Gothic portrays something like kind of beyond us, and portrays the unconscious, the madness, and the horrors, the monsters that we don't know about. And that kind of get me thinking about like the natural world, where we don't know a lot about it, and it's something I think we still don't know about. And that also kind of reminds me of the genre, the new weird as well, or just the weird in general. And I just kind of, my question is, did you think that the Gothic, and by extension the new weird or the weird in general, kind of is a better way of portraying accurately the ecological reality in which we live today, more than, let's say, the realist fiction, for example?
I think your supposition is a good one. I'm inclined to think of part of the mainstreaming of Gothic today, as well as the new weird, as a response to our contemporary moment. The weird famously is associated with Lovecraft, who is problematic in a lot of ways, but develops this notion of cosmic dread, or what he calls the word will come to me in a second. Indifferentism is cosmic indifferentism, in which he depicts a vision of the universe in which human beings are not the center. And we're not even close to the center. We're somewhere on the periphery in this vision of the universe. We're not special. There are powers and forces that exist in the universe that outstrip our capacity to contend with and even to understand them. And we're always in a precarious position of being effaced. And in some of Lovecraft's fiction, he even presents the idea that all civilizations naturally rise and fall. Human beings will be displaced by something after us. We find ourselves in a situation in the 21st century confronting things like climate change that Timothy Morton calls hyperobjects, that are so extended in scale and scope that it becomes very, very difficult for us to comprehend them, much less to grapple with them. So that notion of the weird, of human beings as being very tiny when compared with the sort of the spans of deep time, the interstellar distance and so on, seems to be finding its expression, I think, in 21st century anxieties about human beings precariously poised when confronted by the problem of climate change on the one hand, as well as things like global pandemics and nuclear weapons. So our situation, I think you were right, that the situation that we find ourselves in finds its corollary in weird fiction, which has a Gothic edge to it. I would say the difference between kind of the new weird and the conventional Gothic is in the Gothic, particularly if we're going back to what I was talking about, sort of the religious roots of the American Gothic, you have a stern and angry God who can cause things to happen for reasons that human beings can't figure out necessarily, but nevertheless is singling us out. In Lovecraft and weird fiction and the new weird, we don't matter enough to even be singled out. Like there's a kind of self-aggrandizement that comes with thinking that you matter enough for God to actually kill your cow, or something like that. But where the new weird is concerned, it's just human beings existing in a mechanical universe of sort of cold, impersonal forces, without anybody really caring about us too much, or who would even mourn us if we weren't here. And so I think part of what we're confronting as well is this decentering of humanist pretensions, that we really matter. We like to think that we do, and we spend all this time creating great works of architecture and art and discussing them. But I think weird fiction at its heart asks, how much does any of that really, really matter? It's kind of an existentialist void there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that's why I also really like weird fiction, because it just kind of decenters, the anthropocentrism of humans, really, and especially in the time of ecological crisis. And I think that's what we need. Yeah, thank you so much.
Sure, you're quite welcome.
And I think we have one last question. Monica?
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for your talk. I loved it, and I really do not have a lot to add. I'd like to ask you a question. I think it's very basic beginner thing with the Gothic, but I'm really interested in these distinctions. You've mentioned the Gothic not always being transgressive, but as reaffirming the status quo sometimes, and I found it very interesting. So, as a Gothic, as a scholar of the Gothic, I'd like to ask you if you make any difference between aesthetics and politics when categorizing certain works as Gothic, if it's very clear cut, or well, just some general comments on the very classic debate of aesthetics versus politics.
It's a wonderful question, actually. And you're going to be having a speaker as part of the series coming up, Xavier, whose book on Gothic cinema makes the case that it's all about aesthetics. That, in fact, the fundamental criterion that you use to designate something as Gothic is the way it looks. And I think that's not a bad argument, actually, that we know Gothic when we see it because of the way that it looks. And one of the interesting things that I've been thinking about myself is what I've been calling prestige Gothic. These very Gothic programs with very high production values that seek to engage our attention and kind of almost sort of with this ravishing beautifulness of horrific things. Now you think about horror movies, particularly B horror movies in particular, with having lots of blood and gore and things like that, and being sometimes kind of silly. Now we get shows like Penny Dreadful is the first one that I think of, or Hannibal, that are just sort of gorgeous to look at. And then you step back and realize what you're looking at in Hannibal. And it's the aesthetic more than anything, I want to say, that captures our attention in a lot of contemporary media. There's a kind of gorgeous grotesquerie to the contemporary Gothic. Where narrative is concerned, I think the broadest possible approach to thinking about Gothic and narrative. I think about it as tales of transgression tending towards tragedy, which encompasses a lot. I think it's hard to pigeonhole the politics of the Gothic in any specific way, because I think it depends upon narrative situation. I think in many cases, the Gothic ultimately is conservative in reaffirming the status quo at the end by expunging whatever the threat is that intervenes in the middle, but not always. So it may well be that the defining criterion of the contemporary Gothic is how it looks, more so than any specific political orientation.
It's a wonderful answer. Thank you very much.
So I think we can almost close. I'm going to ask our public to, if they feel comfortable with it, turn on the cameras so you can see them and they can thank you. Public. No. So thank you very much for this very interesting.
Yeah, and thank you very much again for inviting me. I appreciate very much the opportunity to talk to you all.
And I think it was really a great opening for our series, because we really spanned across topics related with popular culture, with the Gothic, and a little bit of goth music, and a little bit of teaching topics. So thank you very much. And I think we can close it here. And bye to all our public. Thank you very much for attending. And some of you we will see again very soon for another recording. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Well.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.